15-year-old girl, narrating what it's like to become an adult. She lives alone because her parents, both lawyers, are always working abroad. Cairo talks about how she finds comfort in writing and how she longs to be loved and not feel so lonely. She also mentions meeting a teacher who is also a writer. Cairo walks into her literature class, where Jonathan Miller, the teacher, is already there, even though the class doesn't start for another hour. She tells him that she lives in Level Hill, which surprises him. He gives her a list of books they will be reading in class, and she responds that she's already read them all, impressing him even more. Soon, her friend Winnie joins them, and we learn this is Cairo's second time taking this class. Cairo's stomach growls, and she leaves with Winnie to get some food. After they leave, Jonathan checks the books Cairo brought to class. His colleague, Boris, walks in and notices the book Jonathan is holding. It's an erotic fiction novel. Boris takes it and starts reading it aloud. Jonathan takes the book back from Boris, and they head off to eat some biscuits that Boris made. Boris finds out that Cairo is the only student who checked out Jonathan's book and tells him. Back at home, Beatrice, Jonathan's wife, is busy with her work. Jonathan tries to get her attention and tells her about Cairo and the kinds of books she reads. He also mentions that Cairo checked out his book from the library, but Beatrice mocks him. She then gets a call from a friend named Amy, and Jonathan leaves to play some music while Beatrice gets angry on the phone. Later, they share a drink, and Jonathan begins reciting lines from a book called Under the Roofs of Paris. They kiss and start dancing, but Beatrice's phone rings, and she has to leave. Meanwhile, Boris complains about having a terrible weekend as he and Jonathan sit outside. They look over at the woods, and Boris jokingly says there could be ghosts there, with the plants feeding on the souls of the dead. Just then, Cairo walks out of the woods and greets them. They ask her questions, and Boris offers her some biscuits before leaving. Jonathan asks if she's not afraid to walk through the woods by herself, but she confidently says that she's the scariest thing out there. As Boris walks down the hallway, Winnie stops him and starts teasing him. He pauses, and they talk, with Winnie mentioning that she wants to be in his class and would like him to tutor her. Cairo watches them from the corner. Winnie then teasingly asks Cairo if she's jealous, as she sings the words in a playful tone. Later, Cairo and Winnie are at Cairo's house, where she's smoking. Winnie asks where Cairo's parents are, and Cairo explains that she doesn't know how long they'll be gone. Winnie then asks if she can help dress Cairo up, suggesting she could look both smart and attractive. Cairo is also working on an essay for Yale, but she's stuck on a question asking about her greatest achievement. They both struggle to find an answer, and Winnie finally tells her that maybe she should experience something worth writing about. Cairo then asks Winnie if she really plans to sleep with Boris, and Winnie admits that she wants her first time to be with an older man. She tells Cairo she feels ready for it. Winnie tells Cairo that Jonathan looks at her differently from all his other students, but Cairo doesn't believe it. In class, Cairo keeps glancing at Jonathan, and he asks her to meet him after school. Boris is in Jonathan's class, asking about Beatrice and the book she's writing. Jonathan invites him to dinner and tells him to shower before coming over. After Boris leaves, Jonathan plays music and starts dancing. When he turns around, he finds Cairo giggling. They sit on the couch, and Jonathan asks if she's been to the scroll sessions at Sally Bunny's, a poetry salon in a Victorian village. He suggests she go next weekend. He tells her that the reason he wanted to see her was because of the story she wrote about a reluctant spider. He recites a few lines from the story, and they continue talking about it. Jonathan then tells her that she's very talented and offers her a head start on the midterm by asking her to write a short story in the style of her favorite author. He says it could help her portfolio for Yale. Cairo replies that she read his book and describes it as grand and tragic romantic horror. She even quotes lines from it. Jonathan tells her that it was the first thing he ever wrote and that he hasn't written anything since he got married and started teaching. Cairo challenges him, saying he's no longer inspired. Winnie joins them as they talk. Later, Boris, Jonathan, and Beatrice go out for dinner. where Winnie is the waitress. Beatrice asks why their order hasn't been served yet, and Winnie offers them drinks. Boris and Winnie mock each other, and Winnie calls Jonathan a boring teacher, which makes Boris laugh. Jonathan explains to Beatrice that Cairo is one of his students, and they start discussing her. Beatrice tells Jonathan that he's better at teaching than writing, and that writing isn't for him. She says it's not because he can't write, but because he chose to stop writing and became a teacher. Jonathan is offended. On Saturday, Cairo visits the poetry salon Jonathan recommended, hoping to find him there. Jonathan joins her and she asks if he knows everyone at the salon. At the poetry salon, a man named Elliot begins reciting a play, and everyone listens attentively. After the play, Jonathan and Cairo step outside. He asks her if she thought the play was bad, and she giggles, saying yes. Later, Boris and Jonathan are sitting in their usual spot when Cairo brings them coffee. Boris offers her a biscuit he made, and she suggests he sell them to raise money for his team. She also offers to help him with Jonathan's schoolwork. Jonathan receives a text from Beatrice suggesting a weekend trip. Cairo and Winnie stop by Jonathan's class, where he's hurrying to leave. He tells them about the trip with his wife, and Cairo asks for his approval on the writer she chose for the midterm. After a brief conversation, Jonathan leaves. Winnie teases Cairo about how she talked to Jonathan, and as they're joking, Boris walks in. He agrees with the idea of selling the biscuits and asks both of them to help. Winnie stops Boris and asks for his phone number to make things easier. After getting Boris's phone, Cairo quickly grabs it and places it in her chest, ready to leave. But before she can, Boris takes the phone back. Meanwhile, Jonathan is waiting for Beatrice to finish when he receives a call from Cairo. She had accidentally left her phone in his bag, so she asks him to drop it off at her place. When Jonathan arrives at her house in the rain, he tells her to come over to his side, where they share a kiss. Back at home, Cairo watches TV and reflects on what's happened. Jonathan, on the other hand, is at home with Beatrice. Beatrice apologizes for canceling their vacation because of work. Later, Jonathan reads Cairo's midterm assignment, which is an intimate story about them. As he reads it, he becomes aroused. On Monday, Cairo waits for Jonathan in class. When he walks in, he greets her coldly and tells her that her story is inappropriate. He asks why she chose that subject, and she replies, "It's about us." Cairo tries to explain that her story is appropriate in different ways, but Jonathan insists that she write a new story with a different author. Cairo tells him to stop treating her like a stranger and demands that he tell her exactly what he means. Jonathan firmly tells her that if she doesn't rewrite it, he will fail her for the midterm. He calls her a child and admits that he feels foolish. In response, Cairo accuses him of being a bad writer and calls him a nobody, impotent and mediocre. She dares him to fail her, crying as she leaves the room. Heartbroken, she thinks of the situation as a car crash. At home, Cairo drinks and cries, with Winnie by her side for support. Meanwhile, Jonathan returns home and tells Beatrice about his bad day. She offers him a drink, and he shares the details of his conversation with Cairo and the story she wrote. Beatrice eagerly asks to see the story. After reading it, she presses Jonathan to explain how Cairo described him in the story. Cairo, meanwhile, asks Winnie to distract her, and Winnie agrees, texting Boris to let him know she's drunk and to ask what he's doing. As Jonathan continues to recite lines from Cairo's story, Beatrice takes his hand and makes him touch her. They stop kissing when Boris knocks on the door and enters. Winnie tells Cairo that she wants Boris to like her and hopes he will sleep with her. Cairo, in turn, makes Winnie text Boris, telling him they're doing what girls do when they're alone at night. Beatrice catches Boris smiling at his phone and asks who he's texting, but he refuses to answer. He replies to Winnie, telling her to go to bed. Cairo, frustrated, tells Winnie to take off her shirt as they're about to make out for Boris's benefit. They get closer and start kissing, while Cairo takes a photo, which Winnie later sends to Boris. Earlier that day, Cairo had sent the story she wrote to the principal. Beatrice gets a call from the principal and hands it to Jonathan. Suddenly, Boris decides to leave, saying goodbye to Beatrice. Jonathan learns that the principal received the story from Cairo and tells Beatrice that he thinks Cairo may have sent it intentionally. Jonathan expresses concern, saying that if the principal believes something inappropriate happened between them, he could lose his job. Jonathan and Beatrice discuss the possibility that something inappropriate might have happened between them when they were teenagers, which could be very dangerous for his career. He wonders if he knows what he's really doing. In the following days, Cairo doesn't show up to school, and Winnie is visibly upset. She asks Jonathan if he's seen Cairo, but he coldly responds that he hasn't. Cairo and Jonathan are called in for questioning by the principal, Joyce. Cairo explains that Jonathan had given her the midterm assignment in advance and that they often met outside of class to discuss literature. She mentions that Jonathan was impressed by her knowledge. Jonathan, in turn, tells Joyce that Cairo is very talented and that he mentored her because she was more advanced than the curriculum. He insists that their relationship was entirely professional, appropriate for a teacher and student. He also explains that he visited her house once to return her phone, and that although they had discussed personal matters, he had never touched her. Jonathan admitted to telling Cairo that the story she sent was inappropriate for school, but realizes that there's nothing he can say to defend himself. Boris later asks Jonathan if he's in love with Cairo, saying that Jonathan can't identify the line between what's right and wrong, which is why he keeps crossing it. This leads to a heated argument, and Boris storms off. Jonathan later confesses to Beatrice that he's been suspended from his teaching job. This sparks a big argument between them, where things get personal. Jonathan calls Beatrice an alcoholic, and she retorts that he's boring, which is why she drinks. The argument only escalates from there. Meanwhile, Winnie goes to visit Cairo and asks what she's doing to Jonathan. Cairo reveals that she's testifying against him at the school board because Jonathan underestimated her. Winnie, feeling conflicted, says she will testify against Cairo, but Cairo blackmails her with evidence of her affair with Boris. Cairo tells Winnie that this is her greatest achievement. The movie ends with Cairo standing on her bed, reading an essay she wrote about her and Jonathan. We see Jonathan losing his job, and Boris and Winnie passing each other like strangers. Finally, Cairo spots Jonathan at school, and although she is hurt, she cries as she watches him. She reflects that what happened between them has shaped her into something new: a hero, a villain, and a writer. The movie concludes, and the screen prompts viewers to watch the next recap and subscribe for more.